Good morning, everyone. I'm Jane Harmon, President and CEO of the Wilson Center, and I'm here to introduce a very special event with Rob Litwak, a longtime member of what I like to call the Wilson family, and a bona fide expert on nuclear non-proliferation and proliferation. Exactly 1 year ago, imagine this, Rob and I sat together on stage, on the real stage, not the virtual stage, at the Wilson Center to celebrate the launch of his monograph, Nuclear Crises with North Korea and Iran. So much has changed, well, not the crises, but so much has changed in the 366 days since then, as you all know. But amid all the uncertainty and upheaval, it's comforting to know that some things never change, including Rob's astounding ability to churn out high quality publications on nuclear issues year after year. With this new one, Managing Nuclear Risks, Rob is on to book number 11, which is available as an ebook on the Wilson Center's website. Rob is our Senior Vice President and Director of International Security Studies, where he's worked for, get this folks, 37 years. I didn't make that up, 37 years and counting. He has also worked on the National Security Council staff and is a consultant to the Los Alamos National Laboratory. You could say Rob has been our canary in the nuclear complex, warning of the persistent and growing nuclear threat in a world, pardon me, my COVID test was negative, in a world distracted, and rightfully so, by the COVID pandemic, cyber threats, and climate change. Managing nuclear risks is a reminder to policymakers that 75 years after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, escalating tensions between nuclear weapons states, nuclear proliferation, and nuclear terrorism remain catastrophic threats. Global health policy has shot up to priority number one because of the pandemic, but Rob is on a mission, and I would say a correct mission, to put the focus on nuclear threats as well, and this time before they upend our lives. To that end, Managing Nuclear Risks delves into the state of US-Russia arms control negotiations, recent confrontations between nuclear-armed Pakistan and India, very worrisome, as well as China and India, more worrisome, the potential for Iranian and North Korean proliferation, and more. I would just point out to you, Rob, you wrote about North Korea and Iran last time. You didn't fix it, just saying. Maybe that's going to be monograph number 12. We're excited to be joined by two very special, wonderful guests this morning. Helene Cooper, there she is, the Pentagon correspondent for the New York Times, and we're proud to say a former Wilson Fellow. Helene will moderate a conversation between Rob and Mitchell Reese, the former Director of Policy Planning at the State Department, who headed a college in Maryland, and also, well, he was Director of Policy Planning under Colin Powell, and he's currently a Wilson Center Distinguished Fellow. So we look forward to hearing them discuss Rob's book and about an issue that has vexed the US government across many administrations. It's a great thing, Rob, that you are the canary in the nuclear coal mine and that you keep your eye on this threat. It honors the Wilson Center, it honors scholarship, and just as an aside, I'm pleased to work with you and delighted that two other members of the Wilson family are joining us this morning. So now please join me in welcoming the wonderful Helene Cooper.
Muted.
Who is muted.
Helene, you need to unmute.
Yeah, got it. Hi, guys. I had to unmute myself. Sorry about that. Hey, Jane, thank you very much. It's great to be back here with my Wilson Center family. I kind of like being, I'm just going to start saying start including myself as a member of the Wilson Center family. And I have never before, Jane, heard nuclear risk be described as comforting. But these are the kind of times we're in. Robert and Mitchell. Robert, it's very great to see you again. Mitchell, it's good to see you. And I'm really looking forward to this. I was talking to Rob earlier this morning, and I thought it would be a great break. Let's talking about nuclear proliferation is a great break from the insanity of Washington today. So let's get started. Rob, do you want to start with giving us a brief overview of managing nuclear risks and where, what some of the major themes of your book are?
Well, Jane, thank you for your kind introduction, and a special thanks to Helene and Mitchell, both former, and in Mitchell's case, a current fellow at the Wilson Center. Thank you for participating today. Let me briefly lay out the main themes of my new book. Last year, in a poll of America's top fears, a nuclear weapons attack ranked 29th. The recent worldwide threat assessments by the Director of National Intelligence have led with the threat of a cyber attack. Yet a nuclear event, like a pandemic or climate change, would be a global game changer. And the risks of that have risen to their highest level since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Consider recent news, and Jane touched on it. With North Korea, Bob Woodward's book, Rage, reveals that during the 2017 crisis, the United States, according to President Trump, was much closer to war than publicly known, amidst concern that the Kim regime could launch a nuclear-armed missile at the US homeland. In 2019 and 2020, two pairs of states possessing nuclear weapons confronted one another along their contested borders. In February 2019, India and Pakistan clashed in the disputed region of Kashmir in a military confrontation that escalated to reciprocal airstrikes. In May-June 2020, India and China exchanged deadly gunfire along their frontier in the Himalayas for the first time in 45 years. These incidents involving conventional military forces inherently carried the risk of escalation to the nuclear level. My study examines the heightened risk across the three major nuclear categories. First, relations among current nuclear weapon states. Second, the possible proliferation of nuclear weapons to additional states. And third, nuclear terrorism. At the outset, I should stipulate that this study did not consider the elimination of nuclear weapons. That visionary objective, the desirability and feasibility of which remains debated, is not on the policy horizon. The study instead explores utilitarian options to ameliorate nuclear risks. For each of the three categories, I focus on a central dilemma. As the late Brent Scowcroft observed, problems have solutions, dilemmas have horns. These policy tensions can't be resolved, but if clearly understood, they can be better managed. So let me turn to the first category, the dangerous complexities of a multipolar nuclear world. Nuclear weapon states are engaged in strategic competition over the territorial status quo in areas of vital interest. This contrasts with the Cold War era, in which the superpowers engaged in competition in the regions of what we then called the Third World, which were clearly of peripheral interest. These regional flashpoints span the globe, from Taiwan and the South China Sea to Kashmir in the Himalayas to the periphery of the former Soviet Union. And they are fueled by nationalism and expansive assertions of state sovereignty. It is plausible that competition could morph into conflict through inadvertent escalation driven by miscalculation and misperception. This is the 1914 model. All right. But this risk is compounded by key developments affecting the nuclear deterrent relationship among competing states. During the Cold War, the great RAND strategist, Albert Wohlstetter, questioned whether the balance of terror was in fact delicate, by which he meant that one side might see an advantage in going first during a crisis to achieve a disarming first strike. That dynamic was evident in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Khrushchev made a desperate bid to redress an imbalance by deploying medium-range missiles with nuclear weapons to the island. In the shock of its aftermath, the Cuban Missile Crisis, that is, both sides developed survivable second strike capabilities that removed the incentive for preemptive action and left both sides mutually vulnerable. Are we recreating the risks of 1962? Are nuclear deterrent relationships, to use Wallstedter's word, becoming delicate? The virtual end of arms control is ushering in an era of unconstrained competition. All the nuclear weapon states have embarked on ambitious force modernization programs, and they are developing capabilities such as low-yield nuclear weapons, which critics warn make them more usable in a crisis. The Trump administration's nuclear posture review claimed, and this is controversial, that the Russians had adopted an escalate to de-escalate posture involving the first use of tactical nuclear weapons. With respect to managing risks, I address both sides of the equation. On one side, ameliorating the regional flashpoints that could give rise to conflict through diplomacy to resolve these flashpoints or confidence building measures to avert crises. And on the other, practical steps to maintain the stability of the nuclear deterrent relationships, such as developing a new arms control architecture to mitigate the risk of unconstrained competition. The second category is the possible proliferation of nuclear weapons to additional states, what policy analysts call horizontal proliferation. In 1962 at the General Assembly, and the General Assembly's meeting this month, President Kennedy gave us a famous speech in which he laid out a nightmare scenario of 35 nuclear weapon states by the mid-1970s. His nightmare didn't come to pass, fortunately, and shout out and footnote to Mitchell Reese, who wrote a brilliant book at the Wilson Center called Bridled Ambition, who explains why states have not opted for nuclear weapons, why we don't live in a world of 35 nuclear weapon states. And there's a rich literature on this. Right now we have the 9 states, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, which entered the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty as nuclear weapon states, India, Pakistan, and Israel is acknowledged but not a declared nuclear weapon state. Those 3 states exercised their sovereign right to not join the NPT. International law, as Jane, the lawyer and Mitchell is a lawyer on this call will know, international law is voluntaristic. Domestic law is mandatory. We have to obey speed limits and pay taxes. You can opt in or opt out of a treaty as a state. So give India, Pakistan, and Israel their due. They didn't join the NPT. North Korea and Iran are treated differently because they signed up to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty deal and they cheated within it. But moreover, for the United States cares about Iran more than Israel. Okay, it cares about Pakistan more than India. The reason we focus on North Korea and Iran is not only because they're flouting the NPT, but both are adversarial proliferators. They combine capabilities with hostile intent. And both, and I've written about this, have been designated by US presidents as rogue states. And the term rogue connoted that the threat of these regimes derives from the very character of their regimes, okay? That the threat is linked to regime type. And hence, in the US debate since the mid-1990s, we've had a debate about the rogue states. Should our objective be regime change or behavior change? And those advocating regime change argue that behavior change is not going to get you there because it's inadequate. The threat derives from the character of the regime. So if you want to turn off the dangerous, threatening behavior, you got to go to the source, as Alexander Haig famously once said. You got to go to the character of the regime itself. President Obama struck the Iran nuclear deal. He made the pragmatic determination that he should go for a transactional agreement focused on the discrete nuclear issue. Their call was that if they went for a comprehensive deal, they wouldn't have gotten any deal with Iran. So he went for a discrete deal to constrain Iran's nuclear capabilities. The critique, of course, was that it was not transformational. It was just transactional, that it didn't address Iran in Lebanon, Iran in Yemen, Iran's human rights records, the whole panoply of issues of concern about Iran. The Trump administration came to office and they withdrew from the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. And Secretary of State Pompeo laid out 12 parameters that Iran had to meet for there to be a new deal. These parameters were comprehensive, but they would require essentially a change of regime in Tehran. Helene's colleague David Sanger said it would essentially require Iran to no longer be Iran because it was comprehensive. The Trump administration's policy toward North Korea was also transformational in the sense that they were going for full denuclearization, as CVID, as the experts call it, complete, verifiable, irreversible disarmament. But the director of CIA, Sir Director Haspel, has testified that zero nuclear weapons is not on the table as long as the Kim regime rules in Pyongyang. The regime views nuclear weapons as essential to survival, regime survival. It's a deterrent. The North Koreans are always noting that Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi didn't have nuclear weapons, and it's the one bargaining chip that they play over and over again. Currently, diplomacy is an impasse with both North Korea and Iran. And I advocate in the study, or my analysis leads to the conclusion that we should pivot back towards transactional diplomacy. And Helene, in the discussion, we can discuss what the terms of that might be. For Iran, it would be essentially a JCPOA plus, entailing some prioritization among the Pompeo parameters to make a deal more realistically achievable. For North Korea, it would entail making a bad situation where North Korea has 30 to 60 nuclear weapons and long-range missiles, et cetera. It would try to make a bad situation from getting worse by freezing testing of missiles and nuclear weapons, and importantly, freezing their production of weapons usable material so the stockpile doesn't get even larger. But the dilemma is that the timelines for nuclear development and regime change are not in sync. The nuclear issue is immediate and urgent, whereas the prospects for regime change or regime evolution, those prospects are speculative and indeterminate. We can't wait for some indeterminate timeline to play out. So I make the case for transactional strategies, delinking the two issues to pragmatically constrain these states' capabilities and buy time as the uncertain regime change, regime evolution timeline plays out. So let me turn finally to the third category, nuclear terrorism. And I know Jane is on the commission for presidential debates, and she and others will recall that in 2004, when the then moderator asked, what is the greatest threat posing to the United States? Both President Bush and Senator Kerry answered, nuclear proliferation, nuclear weapons falling into the hands of a terrorist. That was 3 years after 9/11, when the focus was on preventing a nuclear 9/11. And we know, and Jane alluded to this in her introduction, how the public zeitgeist about this has changed with reason. We're living through or trying to live through a pandemic, and we're facing the harbingers of climate change. But I thought that was worth this month at this time noting the juxtaposition between now and then. For terrorists, there are three pathways to the bomb. They can buy one, they can steal one, or they can build one. Each of these routes requires the involvement of a state, whether through transfer as a deliberate act of policy by the ruling regime, or through what the experts call leakage. That is a failure to exercise sovereign control over weapons and weapons usable fissile material on its territory. The state dimension of non-state nuclear terrorism is thus essential. Al-Qaeda does not have its own uranium enrichment program to produce weapons usable material. So if a nuclear weapon detonated in America, Europe, or elsewhere, what state would be the source of the weapon or the materials that made the weapon? The key countries of concern are Pakistan and Russia, where we're concerned, and Jane's written about this and has been sounding her own alert about these. India, Pakistan, and Russia through leakage, that these materials are inadequately secured and would fall into the wrong hands. And North Korea, where they have robust commercial dealings on a host of items, and there's concern they might find an interest in selling nuclear technologies to non-state actors. That's the risks there with North Korea. Transfer. It's striking, though, the country we call the leading state sponsor of terrorism, it's not on the list. Iran, if a weapon went off, Iran wouldn't be the prime suspect. And that's because under the JCPOA, which is continuing to languish along, Iran's access to weapons usable material has been cut off. So the key to addressing the non-state threat is to implement effective strategies of deterrence on the state level. The goal would be to prevent both leakage by locking down weapons and weapons usable material, and preventing transfer by threatening punitive consequences. So effective strategies on the state level will not eliminate the non-state threat, but are instrumental in achieving that objective. They'll take us a long way there. So to recap, let me recap the three dilemmas in the three categories. For the first category, nuclear weapon states, my bumper sticker for that one is 1914 meets 1962. For the second category, horizontal proliferation, the dilemma of contending horizontal and transformational strategies to address countries of proliferation concern. And for the third, nuclear terrorism, the dilemma of developing state-focused strategies to counter non-state threats. And let me close by reiterating, because it bears underlining, these policy tensions are persistent. They can't be resolved, but if clearly understood, they can be better managed. Back to you, Helene.
Wow, thanks, Rob. I've got like a billion questions I want to go to, but first, Mitchell, let's give you a moment to sort of go through what your initial thoughts were, but please include about what Rob just said. Please include in there, because I haven't read your book, but it sounds great now. Why have states not opted for nuclear weapons? Because I found that fascinating when Rob just said that you'd written about this. And I've always been curious about that myself.
Well, thank you, Helene. First of all, Rob, let me congratulate you on an outstanding analysis of an important challenge facing the United States. Managing nuclear risks is the latest example of the Wilson Center's mission of producing work that transcends partisanship, is grounded in history, demonstrates deep expertise, and has policy relevance for members of Congress, administration officials, and the larger national security community. So I hope that it places this issue back at the top of the foreign policy agenda where it belongs. Now, I found your arguments both sophisticated and provocative, forcing me to think more deeply and even to revisit some of my previous views. So I'd like to offer a few brief and hopefully equally provocative observations before handing it back to Helene, who will ask some specific questions. And I'm going to follow your three categories. So on the challenge of vertical proliferation, there's always the risk of miscalculation. But as long as each nuclear weapon state possesses second strike capabilities where no one has an incentive to strike first in a crisis, there's no reason why deterrence can't be maintained, even in a multipolar nuclear world. After all, India and Pakistan have now had nuclear capabilities for more than 2 decades, and China's nuclear arsenal predates theirs. No one should be sanguine, but all three parties have avoided escalation to the nuclear level, despite clashes at the conventional level. In fact, could we not be encouraged by how robust deterrence has been in these cases, even working when the parties have engaged in conventional level clashes? On the challenge of horizontal proliferation, you argue that a transformational or regime change approach is both speculative and indeterminate. And instead you favor a transactional approach to addressing North Korea's and Iran's nuclear weapons ambitions. But as someone who spent 4 years negotiating with the North Koreans, and then time at the State Department developing policies designed to halt and reverse their nuclear weapons programs, I have to confess that I have a hard time seeing a transactional pathway forward that achieves our foreign policy goals of a Korean peninsula free of all nuclear weapons. The North Koreans have broken or walked away from virtually every deal we've ever negotiated with them. So I can't see how you could convince people that this time would be different. I have a hard time seeing how Congress would appropriate the funds necessary for underwriting such a deal. And I have a hard time understanding how the North Koreans would ever accept the type of intrusive verification regime that we would insist upon as part of a deal. So I'm just having a hard time seeing how anyone can square the circle here. It may be that the best we can do at this time is contain Pyongyang, by reinvesting in our alliances with Seoul and Tokyo and shoring up our deterrence capabilities. And we should always be mindful that the North Korean regime is on the wrong side of history and that one day it will come to an end. Finally, with respect to your third category, nuclear terrorism, you argue that buying, stealing, or building a nuclear device requires the involvement of the state, and effective strategies at the state level are prerequisites for addressing this non-state threat. I agree with everything you've written in this chapter, including your policy prescriptions. So I only want to offer a related thought. Given that it is still challenging for non-state actors to buy, steal, or build a nuclear device, and that hopefully this will only become more difficult in the future, it seems that the smarter play for these groups would be to focus their time, attention, and limited resources at developing something different, namely a cyber terrorism capability. A few strokes on the keyboard could inflict grave damage on the United States, as the Director of National Intelligence has written in the Worldwide Threat Assessment for the past few years, as you mentioned. Now, I know that this is a little unfair because this was not your focus in managing nuclear risks. So I'll just have to wait until your next book to see how we should address this threat. In the meantime, congratulations again, Rob, to you and the Wilson Center for producing yet another excellent publication.
Thank you, Mitchell. And you were kind of impersonating Mike Pence because you didn't answer my question. Why have more states not opted for nuclear weapons?
In a nutshell, it's
yeah.
simply the constraints have been underestimated and the incentives have been exaggerated. And it's also due to a lot of very smart policy decisions that have been made in Washington over the years on a bipartisan basis, I should add. So alliances are important. Civilian fuel arrangements essentially preempt them using this fuel source for a nuclear weapons program. And so again, it's sort of counterintuitive, but fortunately the nightmare scenario that President Kennedy and others imagined in the 50s and 60s hasn't come to pass. Managing 9 nuclear weapon states is bad enough. And as Rob has indicated in this excellent book.
Well, that's the perfect segue, I think, because one of the biggest concerns about Iran getting a nuclear weapon, and I'm going to turn this question to you, Rob, but one of the biggest concerns about Iran getting a nuclear weapon is that would set off other countries like Saudi Arabia and that sort of thing. So I find that really interesting. Rob, I ate up your chapter on horizontal proliferation, particularly as it relates to Iran and North Korea. In the case of Iran, as you mentioned, the Obama administration and 5 other powers signed the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran. In 2018, President Trump took us out of it. I want us to talk later on about your blueprints for how the perfect transactional agreement versus transformational one would work. But first, I want to ask both you and Mitchell. And Rob, I suspect I know what you're going to say, but I want to ask, and I'd like to hear from you. Is Iran closer today to a nuclear weapon than it was 3 years ago?
Thanks, Helene. Iran is continuing to comply by the constraints of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. It's pushing the envelopes. There have been some concerns raised with the IAEA that their stocks of low enriched uranium may exceed the permissible level. There's been discussion with the IAEA about visiting some longstanding suspect sites and gaining access to it. But essentially, Iran is not broken out of the agreement. We have wonderful, deep Iran expertise at the Wilson Center. Our own Hala Esfandiari, for example, and her husband Shel Bakash. And I think the argument is that Iran is sitting back and letting America become the issue in international relations. We pulled out of the agreement. The Europeans hold us responsible for it, et cetera. Thinking, as a utilitarian, that's my ideology of sorts. I looked for what is to be a pragmatic solution moving ahead, and made the case for a JCPOA plus, where we prioritize the Pompeo parameters. For example, Iran, the supreme leaders indicated he'd be willing to accept limitations on ballistic missile ranges. Yemen is sort of a low-hanging fruit of regional conflict. Horrific, of course, but is more susceptible to a solution than Lebanon, Syria. We should go for some prioritization. There is political space for diplomacy, I believe, that could be created. And Iran, despite the bluster on both sides, might see an interest in it. To Mitchell's point, and Mitchell sort of pressed me on North Korea, I think to use the phrase we use at Wilson Center, we're basically in violent agreement on this one. But let me just sort of let me flesh it out. The opportunity for achieving zero full disarmament, we're past that. I mean, North Korea became a nuclear weapon state in 2006. They've developed long-range ballistic missiles. According to the DIA, they've miniaturized their capability, and they're able to put it, you've covered this at the Pentagon, Helene, they're able to put it on top of a missile. The third capability they've not demonstrated, and it took the United States quite a while to work it out, is reentry and targeting. And they've not demonstrated yet. I wouldn't make a bet that they don't have a weapon that could hit the United States, but they've not demonstrated that capability yet. So I think the utility of a freeze is it would prevent a bad situation from getting worse. But it is, as as Mitchell said, and I'm hearing a little feedback, so whoever's not speaking should be on mute, please. To Mitchell's point, we're engaging with North Korea essentially in arms control, not disarmament, because Gina Haspel at the CIA said they're not going to zero as long as the Kim family rules in Pyongyang. Interesting, General McMaster, when he was National Security Advisor, at one point argued early in the Trump administration that North Korea might not be a deterrable state, that diplomacy wouldn't work with North Korea because essentially with the rogue rubric, they're essentially a crazy state, right? North Korea is not a normal state in all the ways we know it's not normal, but it's not a crazy state. And I think one of the psychological dividends of the Trump diplomacy was it's made North Korea more of a normal state, susceptible diplomacy. And to Mitchell's point about achieving a deal, I think analytically a case could be made for a freeze. Whether politically it could be achieved, and Einstein famously said, politics is more difficult than physics. I don't discount the hurdles, but essentially the options had come down to, do we launch a preventive war on North Korea because it's a crazy state that's undeterrable and their possession of these capabilities is unacceptable with all the horrific consequences of that, or do we pursue essentially some form of transactional diplomacy where there's got to be something in it for them to cap capabilities so they don't go up to 100 warheads or have full confidence that they could hit us with a nuclear weapon on a ballistic missile. You were covering the Pentagon, Helene. I read in the Woodward book that Secretary of State Mattis was sleeping in his clothes during the 2017 crisis. He thought there'd be an alert, you'd have to respond immediately. So I think that points to the urgency of it. And I think that transformational diplomacies are just they're thought experiments. I see virtually no application in practical politics in achieving it. It may make for good politics, but it's not achievable diplomatically. Whereas a transactional deal with all the caveats that Mitchell laid out with North Korea might be a possibility. Can I make one last point, Helene? You brought up Iran and you asked Mitchell about, are we in a world of 35 nuclear weapon states? I think there's concern about some of the statements President Trump has made about the reliability of the American nuclear umbrella for Japan and other states, which has and extended deterrence has been an essential tool for constraining the aspirations of states to acquire nuclear weapons. What we're more likely to see, I think, and my analysis and others who've written on this, the Wilson Center had a wonderful book on this topic, is more hedging by states, trying to develop the potentiality to break out to a weapon through possible link to a civil nuclear energy program, think Saudi Arabia and other countries. So we may see more hedging versus states overtly crossing the nuclear threshold.
Mitchell, do you want to take any of that on?
Yeah, just a couple of points. I think that there's a tendency of many governments to demonize what you don't understand. And I think that was certainly the case Immediately after China detonated its nuclear device in 1964, we thought that Mao's China was undeterrable because they were crazy. And then the Cultural Revolution only added to that. We found that wasn't the case. In all my experience, I don't think that the North Koreans are crazy. I think sometimes we have a hard time understanding their behavior and their motivations. But you have a very young leader there now who I think wants to live to a ripe old age, like his father and grandfather. So if you don't think a country is rational, then really all bets are off. But I can't see that there's a lot of evidence for that with North Korea's case. I think also Rob's making the point, really an argument for more diplomacy. In the new administration come January, there will be opportunities to engage North Korea and to engage Iran. And part of the purpose of these engagements is to reach an agreement if possible, but it's also to signal to your friends and allies that you're trying to reduce the threat level, you're trying to lower the temperature, and you get credit for that in other capitals. It's when America is seen as not trying, as not giving a damn, that countries really start to retreat and start to rethink the nature of their relationships with the United States. And just to give another shout out back to Rob, is that the hedging issue was dealt with in a book that Rob and I think both collaborated on at the Wilson Center with the Wilson Center's help, The Nuclear Tipping Point, about 8 or 10 years ago. So hedging is an issue. Again, it really speaks to the leadership role that the United States can and has played in the past, and hopefully the reassuring role that it will play again in the future.
I want to go to Jane because I think Jane has something that she wants to say about that, but I find it very interesting, Mitchell, that you're assuming we're going to have a new administration come January.
No, there's going to be a new administration even if the president gets reelected. Jane?
Well, thank you. I find this issue fascinating. I've been involved in especially in my former role as a member of Congress. And I want to ask about something that didn't get a lot of attention, but it kind of fits in your categories. And then I want to ask about one example that got no attention. First, I want to ask about Pakistan. And I remember thinking that it wasn't just leakage, it was active proliferation by Pakistan under the auspices of their father of their nuclear industry, A.Q. Khan, who I think is still around under some form of house arrest, but is still a celebrated figure there. That a number of nations either bought or got nuclear weapons. And there's a rumor out there that Saudi Arabia has bought its weapon, but hasn't collected it yet. But the specific country that hasn't come up is Libya. And I do remember that whatever shipment was coming out of Pakistan to Libya was intercepted, I think by us. And Muammar Gaddafi, still alive, was confronted, and he surrendered, gave up, or was, in some fashion, no longer accepted the shipment. And it was a big deal that Libya would not be a nuclear state. And then guess what happened? With our involvement, he got murdered in the street. So what lesson does that send to North Korea, which I think uses nuclear weapons as an insurance policy for regime survival, or even Iran, which, as you said, has its capacity capped for the moment, but is also very interested in regime survival. And so it's two parts. Is Pakistan still in the nuke business? And secondly, by supporting what happened, by being complicit in what happened in Libya in the Obama administration, have we made it much harder to have even a transactional deal with some of these folks?
Let me take a shot at that and answer your second question first, second part first. Libya, we all woke up in December 2003 to the surprise announcement in Tripoli, London, and Washington. And Mitchell, I don't know if you had entered government at that point or not, but it was the surprise announcement that Libya was going to disarm. Mitchell was with Colin Powell then, and it happened 8 months after the fall of Baghdad. And there's been debate in the literature about the Libya deal, and I think there's a persuasive argument that what sealed the Libya deal was a tacit but clear assurance of regime survival. That if he fell off of the nuclear program, disarmed, that the United States would not implement the Baghdad option on Gaddafi. And there was a lot of trash talk at that time about regime change after in the heyday of after the fall of Saddam Hussein, before the deadly insurgency set in. And as you note, Jane, 11 years in 2011, Gaddafi was overthrown by NATO as part of a humanitarian intervention. Now, at the Wilson Center, we could have a lively debate on counterproliferation versus humanitarian interventions, but as an academic exercise. But for Gaddafi, it's a distinction without a difference. and in a sense, what you point to is it priced us out of the security assurance market. We can't credibly offer a security assurance, particularly to North Korea, of that would factor heavily in a decision to constrain their capabilities. On Pakistan, you're quite right for bringing us back to A.Q. Khan. And it should be noted that the Pakistan program came from China, which and in that earlier phase thought that more nuclear weapons in the hands of more states was better. They kind of read some of the academic literature on that and thought that more would be better. They've gotten religion on this issue, so to speak. They now believe that constraining the number of nuclear states is better for them. In fact, when the materials were found in Libya, the Pakistan had transferred to Libya. They just photocopied it. Some of the documents had Chinese characters on them. That's how nakedly transparent they were about the provenance of those documents. A.Q. Khan was number one on the proliferation kind of wanted list. In North Korea and in Pakistan, and during the time you were in Congress after 9/11, made assurances that they would curtail those kinds of transfers. And Pakistan made them two states. They provided capabilities to North Korea and Libya. That was different than providing to Al Qaeda or ISIL. I think in Pakistan, and we've got a great South Asian program at the Wilson Center, the concern is infiltration into the nuclear establishment, and you have regional governors being assassinated and Islamists infiltrating the armed forces. And there the concern is that it would leak, that they would transfer to a terrorist group. But I'll pass on to Mitchell, because he wrote about, he's written about both of those cases.
I just want to briefly underscore the point Jane made. After Gaddafi was murdered, the North Koreans published something in their official organ, essentially saying, see what happens when you give up nuclear weapons? We're never going to do that. So Rob's exactly right. We priced ourselves out of the market. In retrospect, in theory, you could imagine a different approach, a much stronger embrace of Libya. But after all, this was one of the worst human rights violators on the planet also. So you can see the downside of doing that as well. So it just shows you the difficulty of trying to unwind some of these programs. And it's obviously much better if you prevent them from happening in the first place.
It's weird, just even going back to that time, still like 2011, in the middle of it, I thought we were living through, like with the Arab Spring, one of the biggest foreign policy crises that I thought I'd ever seen. And that pales in comparison to what happened in 2017. And I know I want to bring this back to North Korea because we have after the fact now, after 2017, realized just how close we came to an actual hot war and how worried people actually were. Like Jim Mattis, when President Trump and Kim Jong-un were threatening to, trading insults. Kim Jong-un was calling Trump dotard and Trump calling him Rocket Man and threatening to rain fire and fury on North Korea if the dear leader kept making threats. And I remember taking a helicopter ride in November of 2017 with Jim Mattis from Seoul to the DMZ. And we're flying over all of this congestion and like residential sprawl. And it was easy to see why the South Koreans were so worried. Newspapers were writing stories about North Korean nuclear range capability, whether California or Washington State could be in range, never mind Seoul or Tokyo. I'm just curious, when you look back now, how close do you guys think we came in 2017? How worried were you at the time? And whether looking back now, do you think we would actually see some sort of nuclear attack coming?
Okay, let me unpack that question, Helene. That's a great one. I think the anecdote from your helicopter ride, and I know Jane and Mitchell have been on these helicopter rides as well, underscore how close the South Korean capital is to the DMZ. It's as close as Baltimore is to Washington, and Seoul has been within artillery range of North Korea, for decades virtually. And so you've had the functional equivalent of a nuclear weapon pointed, at Seoul. And I think it points to the problematic military option, which got some attention with Iran in other periods, like, hey, why don't we just do what the Israelis did with Iraq in 1981, do an Osirak and attack the nuclear capabilities? Well, they're diversified. I'm sure U.S. National Technical Means knows where most of them are, but the North Koreans are adept at hiding them, and it carries a catastrophic risk of retaliation that the North Koreans, that no U.S. president, and I worked on the NSC, and Mitch, you couldn't prepare a decision memo to the president saying, counter-proliferation strike on North Korea's nuclear facilities. Under pros and cons, con could generate general war on Korean Peninsula. That's a non-trivial con. And that's a likely kind of outcome that would be a cautionary for us. I think what was disconcerting, really worrying about 2017, is that you had the combination of North Korean capabilities coming online to be able to hit the United States with a nuclear weapon. That was really the game changer for North Korea. They had a nuclear weapon in 2006. They could threaten South Korea. They were able to threaten regional neighbors. But what really changed was in 2017, when they made clear that they'd put the components together. They had a long-range ballistic missile. They had a miniaturized nuclear warhead, and they could target the U.S. homeland. President Trump, before he became president, tweeted, "It won't happen." And then that led into the year of crisis, where there was no contact, where the optic in Washington was North Korea is a rogue state. It's essentially a crazy state, and deterrence may not work for them. You had Dotard and Rocket Man from us. I have to tip my hat to the North Korean propagandists. They came back with their own Elton John lyric. They called Trump "Madman Across the Water." Kudos to their propaganda department. But we were in a really acute crisis, and we've learned more from the Woodward book. But I think it points to, essentially, we're moving into a situation where we're going to have to rely on what we use with other nuclear weapon states, and that is deterrence.
That's a perfect, well, I wanted to ask you then about deterrence, because how delicate actually is nuclear deterrence today? Why do you believe that deterrence is no longer as effective today as it was before?
Well, there are, deterrence has been has had challenges. It led deterrence failures. There are history of deterrence failures that have been written about. I mean, 1962 was a near catastrophic nuclear crisis. I think the new piece in this book that I've really kind of analytically moved further on, and I've written on these issues in the past on Iran, North Korea. I had something at a publication on nuclear terrorism. I think kind of the new ground I feel I was working and trying to break in this publication was in that first tranche of the challenges of a multipolar nuclear world. And what you have is this dangerous conjunction where nuclear weapon states are facing off over territory that they consider of vital interest. And the escalatory potential is significant and real. At the same time, the nuclear deterrent relationships, let me unpack the word delicate, okay? Nuclear dyads are being replaced by nuclear triads, okay? We used to think US-Russia, China-US. Now it's US, Russia, China. And you know, Helene, from your coverage in the Pentagon, that one of the conditions for why we pulled out of the INF Treaty and are balking at a New START deal with Russia is we want to bring China into it to handle their capabilities. So you're moving from dyads to triads. At the same time, there's been this persisting tension in all the nuclear weapon states, I would say, because no one, I mean, living with assured retaliation, living with vulnerability is a psychologically uneasy position for policymakers to take. We don't want to be vulnerable to Russia as we've been since the Cold War. They could put us out of business as a society. We don't want to be vulnerable to China, and we certainly don't want to be vulnerable to North Korea. Okay, and you get this tension between is the purpose of nuclear weapons to deter other nuclear weapons, or is it to engage in war fighting? And what we see on the fronts of technology and on the fronts of and in politics and strategic doctrine are developments that are skirting on the issue of whether nuclear weapons have a role in war fighting and war damage limitation. Tactical nuclear weapons. The United States is exploring it. Pakistan has deployed them. That raise the risk of early use. This concern that the Nuclear Posture Review mentioned, the assertion that Russia has a escalate to de-escalate strategy. So what you're seeing is that the uncomfort with mutual vulnerability and living with assured retaliation from an adversary, those concerns as foreign policies are being nationalized, renationalized, and hyper-nationalized, the discomfort with that in tandem with new technologies and strategic doctrines that open the door to earlier use of weapons create the ingredient for a 1962 crisis. And what makes this worse than 1962 or 1914 in isolation is you get them in tandem. You get 1914 inadvertent escalation from a flashpoint combined with questions about the nuclear deterrent. To make one last wonky point, there used to be a debate in the literature about something they called the stability-instability paradox. And it went that if you had a stable nuclear deterrent relationship, that opened the door, and this goes a bit to the point that Mitchell was making in his comment. The stability-instability paradox opened the door to instability in peripheral areas, that you could have a stable, the US and Russia can compete in Vietnam during the Vietnam War or in Angola or whatever, but you had a reasonably stable nuclear deterrent relationship. What happens when the stability-instability paradox starts coming apart? Because you're having instability in areas that aren't actually of peripheral interest, they're of vital interest. And at the same time, this nuclear deterrent relationship that you thought, well, this is pretty stable, is actually undergoing stressors that make it less stable and open the door to early use. One last point, my second last point, I just wanted to recall, because the neuron in my brain hyperlinked to this topic, is I recall from the early 2000s, there was a debate in the Pentagon. There was a doctrine, you may recall, Helene and Mitchell and Jane, dissuasion, that we were such an awesome superpower, the hyperpower, that other countries would just opt out of competition with us, and that we could leverage our superiority to essentially dictate terms to other states. And in the current literature among academics, I don't see it in the policy, China, interestingly, has a minimum deterrent stance. It doesn't have a lot of nuclear weapons. They're in the dozens. They're not in the hundreds approaching thousands like the United States. And among analysts, they raise the question, does this open the door to the United States implementing or carrying out a disarming first strike of China during a crisis? If Chinese analysts read those articles in the American literature, that's an argument for China building up its strategic forces to the size of the United States and Russia.
You have wandered beautifully, not wandered actually, into the whole idea of whether we're headed into great power conflict. And Mitchell, I would like to hear from you about this as well, because when you start raising issues like first strike and taking out China's nuclear arms early on, that takes us in a direction that is hugely frightening. In December 2017, the Trump administration published its new national security strategy, and it was all about, how we should shift to great power rivalries, away from this focus on terror that had driven American national security strategy since 9/11. So are we indeed entering a new period of great power conflict? It certainly seems that way with China and with Russia as well. Mitchell, do you want to start?
Yeah, thank you. I think we are already in a period of increased great power competition. And whether it devolves to conflict or not, I think is up to us. I think that there's no question now that the debate over China has shifted over the last few years on a bipartisan basis. And no one should be under any illusion about the behavior of Putin's Russia. So I think that the competition is out there, but it's also mixed with important elements of cooperation as well. So if we get back to Rob's central thesis about managing these nuclear risks, and let's accept his argument, which is persuasive, that deterrence has eroded over time and there are these new elements that are making it more problematic. It's really an argument for more communication, not less, for more diplomacy, not less. I think it's significant that after the 2017 scare on the Korean Peninsula is that the president and Kim Jong-un did meet together, not once, but twice, unprecedented. After the clash in the Himalayas, Wang Yi, the foreign minister, met with his counterpart from India. I mean, again, that wasn't scheduled. They both realized that they needed to walk this back. Now, you never want to have to walk somebody off the ledge, and really doing it in advance makes a lot more sense. This gets to the point Rob made that really there's been a decline in arms control over the last few decades as well. So again, I think that the instruments are out there that we need to take advantage of, maybe rediscover. And so we never want a competition to ramp up into conflict. And I'm confident that, that we're able to control that. I think that we have some control over our destiny here. And the biggest risk, as Rob identified clearly, is miscalculation, which has always been the case ever since the dawn of the nuclear age. And it's just a problem, as he says, that we can't resolve completely. We're just going to have to manage as best we can. And more communication, talking to our adversaries, I think is one way to do that.
Thanks. We have like 1 minute left, and I know Rob has probably 5,000 more points that he wants to make, but you can make one. So I'll turn it over to you, Rob.
Well, let me make 2 points, Helene. First, I want to acknowledge a question from Sir John Scarlett, the co-chair of the Wilson Center's Global Advisory Council. And he raised a question about November 1983 and that war scare and whether that's relevant to this debate. I think it is. I didn't address in my publication an important topic, but it's a separate one, of accidental war. And there you have the heroic, colonel in the Soviet on duty who saw a blip on radar and didn't authorize a launch of Soviet missiles, saving the world. But it occurred in a context where NATO had made deployments of intermediate range nuclear forces, and there was heightened tension on both sides. So the risk of accident, what Mitchell pointed to, of miscalculation and misperception, was high. That's why the need for diplomacy and strategic dialogue with our competitors, so that we have lines of communication and we can clarify strategic concepts and put nuclear force modernization into context, so that this does not become unconstrained competition. My second point, and I won't elaborate on it, but I want to end on a positive, hopeful note, possibly hopeful note. We started off by saying, Jane says, we're trying to live through a pandemic. We're facing the harbingers of global climate change. It's hard to get the nuclear on the agenda. What are the prospects for cooperation among the powers? Okay. On Monday, we had a meeting with John Eikenberry at Princeton, who's the world's kind of leading theorist of liberal internationalism, which is associated with Woodrow Wilson. And he made the case, the contemporary case for internationalism. And liberalism, internationalism, sometimes called idealism, is juxtaposed to realism, which focuses on the distribution of power among states. If you are a realist, and there are a number of prominent realists out there who've made a prediction that we're headed for a geostrategic crackup with China in the middle of this century. Could there be a 1914 with China? We could mismanage our way into that kind of war with China. I don't preclude the possibility. But the realists who focus on just what each state can do on its own, they really miss the point vis-a-vis the challenges of today. If if humanity is going to avoid, spoiling and destroying the biosphere, those solutions transcend state strategies. Okay, just each state acting on its own. We have to collaborate on pandemics, on climate change in a collaborative way. It can't be 1930s type beggar thy neighbor's policy. If we go down that route, we will not get, as global society, leverage on these vital threats that face us. And that includes nuclear, where we should resume the nuclear security summits that occurred under the previous administration to lock down and secure weapons. It should include the initiation of strategic dialogues with our adversaries so that these risks of 1914 and 1962 can be mitigated.
Thanks a lot, Rob, and thank you, Mitchell, and thank you, Jane. This conversation has been great. It's reminded me of what I miss about the Wilson Center, is those great chats we would have about issues like this in the cafeteria, as opposed to the talks I have with myself in my kitchen while in lockdown.
Well, we miss you too, Helene. We miss you, and we miss our cafeteria. So there, we are doing great virtually, but we're doing as great as we are because people like you stay in touch. Mitchell, thanks for your current service. And Rob, when is monograph number 12 going to be issued? 365 days from today? You're muted.
No commitment now. I'm not the Stephen King of strategic studies. I don't have a book a year in me, but I feel like at some point I will have another book in me, and I'll keep you posted. Well,
let's also hope that whenever that happens, we'll be actually together again. I mean, this is a long siege, but it is not a hiatus from assessing and as Mitchell said, trying in a bipartisan way to provide at least some way forward on tough issues. And we're in the game. You are all helping us be in the game. So, and thanks to the listeners of this program, because you're the ones who help us succeed, and we're very grateful to you. Stay safe.
Thank you.